This recording was produced by Oregon Trail Baptist Church. If you'd like to get more recordings, or to leave your feedback, please visit us at www.otbchurch.com or write us at P.O. Box 298, Guernsey, Wyoming 82214. We look forward to hearing from you, and we hope that today's recording will not just challenge your thinking, but will transform your life.
Good morning. Let's get started here if you would. We're just going to start right away here this morning with a song for the Ten Commandments. This will help us get to remember them and kind of get them in our head here this morning. So I'll get it started right away.
Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou nor thy son nor thy daughter, thy manservant nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's. Exodus 20 verses 3 through 17.
All right, this morning we're going to cover the second commandment, and actually we're only going to begin to cover that one. It's no other idols, no graven images. Here we have in verses 4 to 6 of Exodus 20, it says, Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me. So again, following our format here, we're going to take a look at a few of the key words here. The idea of a graven image is simply any sort of figure or image that might be made out of wood or metal or any other type of object, but it's specifically made for the object the purposes of worship. Now, not always were they worshiping the image itself, but they were using the image as a way to worship the deity or the demon or whatever it was that they believed the image represented or housed. So these were very common in the ancient Near East, and in some ways are still common today. They would excuse me. Let's talk a bit about the role of the idol. The idol played the role of, it really, to their mind, it localized a deity. It brought some sort of a spiritual being to a level that they could coerce and they could understand it. The primary significance to this was in the fact that the deities were thought to be present in the statue. This is how they were understood. Now, there was a difference in understanding here between what might be the priestly class or the upper class of people who would understand the statue itself didn't have powers. It was a deity that possessed it that did, and some people, quite frankly, missed that aspect. People who thought that idol itself had power. That does come up in the ancient Near East. However, really, the significance of what's going on here is the idol is a way to call for a deity of some sort to come and possess it. The idol formed the primary locus or medium for a deity to manifest itself in the world. It was a way for these spiritual beings to manifest themselves. It tied their presence to a location, to a physicality. And that's what was going on. And the ancient world, they thought this was functional. They thought it worked. And this is how invisible deities was one way they could become visible in the world of humans. As one writer put it, he said, a statue or image of a god represented that god on earth, just as the image of a king represented the authority of a king in the land he had conquered. These idols represented the gods, and they were, almost think of it as we would pick up a telephone to communicate with someone on the other end. These idols almost functioned as a phone or a portal, connecting them with a spiritual entity. Now also, the idol provided the human, whoever had the idol, a level of control over the deity. It was a way of cajoling it or coercing it or bartering with it. This is one of the reasons God said, no idols of me, none, no graven images. Well, why? You're not going to cajole God. You're not going to manipulate God. You're not going to coerce him. He needs nothing. And I find it very interesting that as I'm reading, and I honestly, I don't understand this. I don't understand how this logic can be this way. But the one thing an idol could not do, it could not eat. So these spiritual beings and powers that they wanted to coerce, and they wanted them to change their destinies and lives, they wanted to circumvent and go around God's ways and God's methods to seek spiritual help and guidance from these demonic beings, and these beings can't eat without your help. I find that incredibly fascinating and interesting, especially when you have stories of these beings or these idols. For instance, in I believe it's Bel and the Dragon, the kind of appendix apocryphal book to the book of Daniel, you have a story there of an idol that's getting offered food, but the priests know that it's not going to eat it, so they go in and eat the food and then claim that the idol ate the food, and there's a trap laid, and they discover that the priests and their families have been eating this food. So I don't understand how this thinking would work, in that this God or this entity is so powerful, yet they can't feed themselves. It just boggles my mind, and there's probably more to uncover, and probably someone who's done more research in this field would be able to really shed light on that. But I want to talk a bit here about the production of these idols, these graven images. Idols were produced, but they went through different stages. And there's a really good journal article I was reading on this. It's, quite frankly, really helpful to me, but it broke it down into 3 categories. So the first part of the idol's creation is called purification, and this is where you're taking the wood, you're taking the gold or the silver, you're taking the materials, and you're actually building the idol. Now, this process of making the idol, first of all, called for qualified artists. You didn't have your child make an idol. You didn't have a second-rate artist do it. It was a skilled artisan doing this craft. Why? Well, you actually wanted to please the god and give him a good-looking idol. All right? It'd be like in the 16th and 7th century before cameras, when you got a painting of yourself. You didn't want your little kids drawing it. You wanted a professional doing a family portrait or painting. Why? Because they could really do a good job. Whereas your kid, well, you're going to get stick figures. Okay? So these idols, they would use qualified, skilled artists, and they would obtain, there's documents talking about the material they obtained. They went to great lengths to get certain materials for certain deities. It was an expensive process. It was a grand undertaking, but it was that important to them. The second element here of the creation of an idol is a phase where it was called or classified as vivication. And this second phase, they would perform a ritual called the opening of the mouth. And it's been described here as vivication. It gives life to the idol. It's bringing this inanimate object to life and to cultic use. Now, this practice is not abandoned in our world. This practice is not done away with. This whole process is still very real and still very active in other portions of the world. We don't see this much in Western culture. But I have an excerpt here from a website from a Hindu who comes out and says, this concept or practice of calling on a spirit or god to dwell in an idol is very similar to modern Hinduism. He said, and the quote here, he says, he's a practicing Hindu. He says, we ask the god to come and inhabit this form so we can have somewhere to direct our energy and focus. Now, he's putting it in language of energy and focus. But while I was in India, I seen these idol shops. You'd see these grand concrete or wood idols and statues, and they weren't technically idols yet. They were just things. They were just statues. And the practicing Hindus would buy these, take them to a local temple. The priest would do a ceremony, and I believe there was some blood involved. I'm not sure, and I'm not sure I want to know. But there was a religious ceremony they went through, and then they would take the idol home. And the idol was not valid. It was not legit unless it had gone through this ceremony where the Hindu priest calls for a spirit or a being or whatever to come and inhabit the idol. Folks, the ancient world isn't so different than ours. I mean, in some ways, yes, it was, but when we find some of these practices from the ancient Near East still in India and Chinese culture today. And again, as I said, the Western world has pretty much gone away with some of this, but this was how the idol was brought to life. The third aspect here of the creation of an idol is one that is kind of odd to think about and a little funny, maybe to our sound, but it's the enthronement. So after you've created this idol, and after you have vivified it, or you've given it life, you've performed a ceremony or whatever to tie that idol to a spiritual being, after that takes place, you then place the image in its temple or shrine or where it will be located for you to access it, for you to cajole it, for you to care for it. I don't know if you remember in the late 90s, there was these little pocket pet things, that little electronic pets that you had to feed and water and do things like that. And this is what I'm almost thinking of when I'm thinking of these idols they have to take care of, and these kids would carry with them and take with them to all over. But here, the enthronement stage is where sacrifices and offerings would be made to these idols, and it would accompany a feast. You would maybe make a big deal of when you place this idol. Now, the article I was reading that I found fascinating and helpful, it tied these three aspects: the purification or creation, the vivification, and then the enthronement. It tied these to actually how God has dealt with his prophets, which is a very, very fascinating thing. You see, God, and Moses was used as an example here. God is our creator, is he not? He made all humans. He made us in his image. And if God made us, and he did, then the next part is he vivifies, or he gives us power. He gives us his authority, his calling, his sanctions, and his message. We see this with Moses. Moses at the burning bush. He is one of God's people. He is created by God, and God gives Moses a message. He sets him apart. He gives him a message. He fills him with his message for his people. And then the enthronement sounds a little funny. Don't think of it like sitting on a throne, but think of it as God puts Moses in a place where he's going to use that message, i.e., talking to Pharaoh. In fact, in that passage, God tells Moses, I will make you a god to Pharaoh. The logic behind idolatry is so that you could have some sort of an image or a locality to worship a god, but the God of the Bible, Yahweh or Jehovah, doesn't want and doesn't need an idol. And here's why. He already made one. In fact, he didn't make one. He made a lot of them. In Genesis, we read that we are created in the image and likeness of God. You see, the idols didn't always portray a specific aspect of the deity. They weren't always tied. They didn't always look the same. You could have several different looking idols all representing the same deity. But God made humanity in his image. In the image of God made he them. And there's some things going on in the Hebrew there, and I'm no Hebrew scholar to discuss this per se, but there's stuff going on in the Hebrew that you can translate that not necessarily as a once and all we are his stamped image, but that we are his imagers, a continual process, and by our actions and by what we do, we image God. Now, of course, that image is marred, and that image to some degree has been lost. But doesn't the New Testament say we're being conformed into the image of Christ? Folks, there is an important aspect. We don't worship idols. We don't use them in worship because God has already made us to be his representatives here on earth. And just like Moses, just like the prophets, I think of Isaiah, who had the burning coal experience where it came and it touched him, and he gave him a message from the mouth of the Lord as God gave him that message there in the throne room experience. God has created us. That's the purification process. God has breathed his life into us, and as New Testament Christians, we have the life of Christ within us. The Holy Spirit and the life of Jesus moves inside at the moment of salvation. You say, well, yeah, but what about enthronement? I'm not going to oust God, am I? No, of course not. But God put you in a place. He may put you in darkest Africa, and he may put you somewhere here in Guernsey, Wyoming. He may put you in Cheyenne. He may put you in Indonesia. God may put you in an office. God may put you on a ranch. God may put you in a unique situation with unique talents. But God knows where he wants his presence to be made known in an area, and he does that through his people. In the Old Testament, you could say he did it through the prophets. But clearly in the New Testament, it's through the lives of God's people. So this whole process was very, very real to the ancient Near Eastern person. I want to get into here an article or a section from the New American Standard Commentary on idolatry. The reason I want to get into this is it laid out some of the attractions to idolatry. And what was it that was so attractive to people? Why would you leave worshiping the God? Why would you leave a loyalty and allegiance to a God who can part the Red Sea, and a God who can bring thundering lightning down from heaven, a God who can bring 10 plagues on Egypt? Why would you be attracted to leave him and serve an idol? And I'm just going to walk through some of these things. It's kind of a clipped version here, but again, it's from the New American Standard Commentary on Exodus. It says, the nature of idolatry is usually misunderstood by modern people. That is an understatement, folks. We think that because we are modern and they were ancient, we think they were stupid. But they weren't. One of the reasons for the prohibition against idolatry was not the fact that it didn't work, but the fact that it did work. Just like witchcraft and just like sorcery. These things worked to some level. And sure, there were some charades and shenanigans that went along with it. But it worked. So the nature of idolatry is usually misunderstood by modern people. Idolatry was not merely the practice of worshiping by means of statues or pictures as a focus of worship. It was rather an entire, elaborate religious system and lifestyle. All of it running counter to what God desired and desires true worship to be. First of all here, one of the attractions of idolatry was its guarantee that it provided. The ancients assumed that the presence of a god or a goddess was guaranteed by the presence of the idol. Since the idol partook of the very essence of the divinity it was designed to represent. This was really, they thought, hey, we have the idol, nothing can happen. I think when the Ark of the Covenant was in the presence of the idol for the god Dagon in the Philistine camp, and 2 to 3 times that idol fell until it was smashed and broken to pieces. That was the presence of Dagon, and there it fell at the presence of the Ark, which was seen as the presence of God. The second attraction to idolatry here is that of selfishness. Idolatry was an entire materialistic system of thinking and behavior, sometimes called the fertility cult, built on the idea that gods could do virtually anything but feed themselves. The one sort of hold or advantage humans had over the gods was the ability to feed them. So you're wanting this God, in essence, to do for you the things you can't do for yourself. You want this God to make your business successful. You want this God to bring you children. You want this God to fill in the blank. It's a means of coercing the quote-unquote spiritual world to get what you materially want. Almost in my mind, sort of like voodoo today, where you poke a doll here in hopes it hurts somebody over there. Idolatry was easy. Frequently and generously, they would worship and offer sacrifices to these idols. This was the sole significance and sole requirement of faithful idolatrous religion. Idolatry minimized the importance of ethical behavior. Look, if all you had to do to be right with God and to have the divine blessing you was tip $10 a week to the offering plate or something like that. If that's all you had to do, man, that'd be easy. Set me up for automatic withdrawal. And you could walk away and practically forget about it. That's what's going on here. These idols, it was easy. You could simply bring some food, make a little sacrifice. It didn't matter how you lived. It didn't matter how you treated your wife. It didn't matter how you treated your kids. It didn't matter what you did to your neighbor. That didn't matter as much as did you make your offering. It was easy. Not only was it easy, but it was convenient. These ubiquitous idol shrines allowed worshippers to take a sacrifice to the god or goddesses of their choice virtually any time of day or any day of the week. And at a location nearby, any place they happen to be. By contrast, His covenant required that all Israelites report to a single central location 3 times a year. This necessitated costly and time-consuming travel for many, and it prohibited worship elsewhere in the land, but at that single approved sanctuary there in Jerusalem. Now, there's a bit of debate on this, I guess, because Israel didn't start off this way, but that's where God took them. They started off like with Abraham, and they worshipped at many different places, but as the law was codified and brought into existence, there was one place, that was Jerusalem and the temple, where worship was to take place. So it was convenient to worship an idol. I can do it on my time schedule. I can do it in my hometown. I don't have to travel. I don't have to do this, and I don't have to do that. It was convenient. It was also normal. You say normal? Well, what's abnormal to you and me was normal back then. This was such a common way of religion, without exception outside Israel. It was seen as normal. It was well settled. It was the experienced Canaanite way. Do it when you're in Rome, do as the Romans do, right? So hey, they've been doing this for years. When the Israelites entered Canaan, they could hardly help thinking that the successful farming methods of the Canaanites necessarily involved various idols, magical rites, and other things used for generations. Things like boiling a goat in the kid's mother's milk, to sowing a crop in a special pattern with 2 different kinds of planted seed. If an Israelite asked a Canaanite neighbor, how do you farm around here? The Canaanite neighbor would probably start his explanation with a description of how to make a proper offering to Baal or Ashtaroth in advance of preparing the fields and planting and other farm duties. In order to ensure the fertility of a farm, you would do these things. Moreover, idolatry was a way of the superpowers and the economic successful states whose riches and prestige seemed to go hand in hand with their idolatrous rites. Look, the big boys, Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, they all did it. And if we want to play on the big boys' league, we better do it too. God told his people, don't even inquire about their gods, because they would be corrupted. We don't think in this realm, but this is why idolatry was attractive to them back in the ancient Near East. And to them, it actually came out, it was logical. Idolatry just was part of a polytheistic, centricistic, pantheistic system. The ancients believed in many gods, and every one of these gods had a special being or special asset he would bring, a special toolkit. He had special abilities that only he really had. And therefore, the ancients found it enormously attractive to think that they could gain assurance of these gods through these idols, each one with its own special ability. And if they could coerce them, and they could get these gods to do for them what they can't do for themselves. And the idea of a general practitioner god was not really existent. And yet, the God of Israel is the God who's the specialist of all things, the creator God who made all things. He holds all things in his hand. And even these false gods, they're under his dominion and control. Idolatry also was quite frankly pleasing to the senses. In 1 Kings 9:18, it describes the Israelite practice of worshiping a fertility weather god Baal by in part bowing down to his idol and kissing it. Ezekiel 8:9 and following details some of the extensive descriptions of the various creatures in idolatrous form of worship in Jerusalem. Idolatry provided worshippers with images of deity pleasing to the eyes. Again, these were made with well-crafted, skilled craftsmen and carpenters. It spawned and entrenched the whole industry of image making because it was appealing. It appealed to the senses, and broadly speaking, to the artisans and people. It was hard to appreciate the beauty or attractiveness of someone who refused to be seen, like God. Now, there is something interesting here. Those who've studied ancient Near Eastern cultures have noted this. Because of this command against idols and idolatry, the one area of art that the Jews or Hebrews did not develop as extensively as the other nations was the area of sculpturing and painting. Those aspects of art Israel didn't develop as much as they did in their literary writing skills. And that probably harkens back to this command, although let me bring you back to our verse here. It says, thou shalt not make any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above or earth beneath or the water. Then it says, thou shalt not bow down thyself to them nor serve them. Look, the commandment is not against making a little giraffe or an elephant or a little thing and then giving it to your child to play with. That's not the point of the command. It's not against having little figurines and stuff that you set up for decoration. That's not against the command. What's against the command is making them with the intent of worship. You can't worship these. And again, it says here, this is something interesting. It says the judgment or the consequence of this is God's going to visit the iniquity of this upon the fathers unto the third and fourth generation. It's coming down the pike. And probably the reason of that is because each generation trains the next. You train your children to hate God, and they train their children to hate God. And it takes a mighty pull or a mighty change for a child to turn from the ways of his parents, especially when you have the flesh driving it. These idolatry practices were quite indulgent. Pigging out typified pagan sacrifices. In contrast to the more clearly symbolic value of Orthodox Israelites' worship, heavy drinking and drunkenness were also considered proper in an idol worship feast, because debauching oneself was simply part of being generous to a god. The more you ate, the more you drank, the more you were being kind and generous to the god. And lastly here, this one is really shocking to our mind. But idolatrous worship was erotic. It's hard for me to discuss this, especially knowing that there's some children here. But temple prostitutes was part of this system. And everything was born into existence. So the fertility for this year's season had to be born into existence. And you couple that with the concept of sympathetic magic. And if you're not familiar with that, again, it's kind of like the voodoo. You do something here that's similar to this item over here, and what happens in place A will then be duplicated or magnified in place B. Folks, they would come to the idol or the temple. They would engage in prostitution. Both male and female prostitutes were available, and the purpose of this was to get the gods in heaven to do the same. This jars our thinking. This is grotesque. This is what they did. Now I want you to put this in process. If you haven't heard this before, there is a lot of documentation on this. But let me say it this way. Now do you understand why God was so adamant with his people not to learn the way of the Canaanites? Not to follow their practices? Not to get involved in their idolatry? Folks, our God knows what he's doing, and he loves his people. He knows what's best for us. And although to the ancient person this form of idolatry seemed very attractive, it made sense, it was logical to them, we have God coming on the scene with the 10 Commandments, with his people saying, you ain't doing that. Now folks, you'd say, well, I've never heard idolatry preached this way. That doesn't sound like the idolatry of the New Testament. Well, that's part 2. We're going to get to there. Because the New Testament doesn't dismiss this concept. It simply adds to it. But what I'm looking at here, these idols were real. They wielded some level of power because they were connected with spiritual, yea, demonic beings. And they were prohibited by God. You stayed away from this. It's interesting, these idols were not simply meant to be put in the back room when they were conquered. They were to be broken, smashed, destroyed. And when you destroyed these idols, it didn't necessarily destroy the god in the ancient's mind. They would simply build another one. For instance, the Philistines built another god, Dagon. They built another idol. They didn't view the god as destroyed. But my point here is, these gods were real. These demonic or spiritual beings were real. Maybe say little g gods. And this was a way that they could be harnessed. But you're not going to harness God. You're not going to put a bit in the God of Israel's mouth and control him. He is in control. The best thing you can do, as the New Testament image gives us, is yoke up with Jesus. The best thing you can do is yoke up with him and follow his lead. Now, we've kind of gone a little bit long here today, so I'll leave it there. But we'll pick up next week with how the New Testament picks up the theme of idolatry and carries it further. And let's close in a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for your word here this morning. And as we're looking through the 10 Commandments and this command against idolatry, Lord, what we've covered in the Old Testament seems very foreign to us because these concepts just don't pervade our culture, which is why the New Testament will be so important. But these shouldn't be that foreign because other cultures in our world today still practice many of these aspects of many things going on here. Lord, I ask that as we study this and as we look at this, it would give us a total disdain for the evil of idolatry around the world, the evil of idolatry in the Bible. Would we get how significant this was and how damaging it was to every aspect of life? And Lord, you've called us not to conform to this world, and you've given us a vivid illustration of how the Israelites failed that. Instead of being conformed to you and your laws, they allowed the nations to form them in their thinking and their logic to these idolatrous practices that ultimately led them to exile. Lord, don't let us be taken to spiritual exile. I ask that you work in our hearts this morning. In your Son's name, amen.